They were just two dusty girls with nowhere to go, abandoned, unheard, forgotten, beneath the weight of a world that had already given up on them. But one man, a quiet stranger, with a guitar and a past he never spoke of, pulled over in the blazing heat and changed everything. What happened next left an entire Western crowd silent, and it all began with a single note. If stories of quiet courage and unexpected miracles speak to you, take a moment to subscribe. We share real soulful stories that remind us all healing begins when someone chooses to listen. Now let me tell you the story behind the song that healed the dust. The Texas sun showed no mercy that afternoon. It baked the cracked earth and turned the wind into dry whispers that stirred only dust and ghosts. The road to nowhere, Route 87, stretched like a faded scar through the bone-dry hills of dusty rock. And down that forgotten road rolled a beat-up Ford pickup, coughing its way through heat shimmer and memories too loud to ignore. Rowan Blake kept one hand on the wheel and the other draped loosely over the neck of a guitar case on the passenger seat. The strings inside hadn't sung in years. Neither had he. His eyes, tired but sharp, scanned the roadside like he always did, not out of curiosity but habit. The same habit that once saved a wild calf from dying tangled in barbed wire. The same instinct that made him notice things other people were too busy or too hardened to see. That's when he spotted it. A bundle of burlap sacks, haphazardly tossed behind a rusted-out hay trailer on the side of the field. It wasn't the burlap that caught his eye. It was the way it shifted. He pulled over. The truck door groaned as it opened, and his boots sank slightly into the sun-baked dirt as he approached. At first it looked like just another pile of discarded farm supplies. But then a whisper so faint he wasn't sure it was real floated to him through the air. June. Rowan dropped to his knees and pulled back the sacks. There, curled together like frightened kittens, were two little girls, barefoot, dust-covered, trembling. One had a streak of dried blood on her knee. The other clutched a ragged stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. They couldn't have been older than 7. Rowan's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He blinked, but they didn't vanish. This wasn't a dream or a memory, or one of those waking nightmares that still clawed their way in when he smelled diesel or heard a certain harmony. "Hey there," he whispered, crouching lower. "It's all right. I'm not gonna hurt you." One of the girls lifted her head just barely, her eyes impossibly blue and glassy with heat, locked with his. And then the other followed her lower lip, trembling. "Are you?" He hesitated, alone out here. Neither answered. The one with the rabbit just leaned in closer to the other. Rowan took off his shirt, exposing his sweat-drenched undershirt, and wrapped it around the smaller one. "You're burning up," he muttered. "Where's your mama?" No answer. A fly buzzed past. Somewhere in the distance a hawk shrieked. Without another thought, Rowan scooped them both into his arms, light as feathered sorrow, and carried them to the truck. He laid them gently across the back seat, rolled down the windows, and turned the engine back on. The AC barely worked, but it was something. He drove straight to the only place he trusted anymore home. It wasn't much. A cabin he'd built himself on the outskirts of Dusty Rock. No neighbors, no luxuries. Just space, quiet, and the echo of a life he once tried to live with music and dreams and promises he couldn't keep. Molly, his daughter, 13, and wise beyond her years, was reading on the porch swing when he pulled up. She jumped to her feet as soon as she saw the truck halt abruptly. "Dad, get a wet towel. And water." Now he ordered, pulling the girls into his arms again. Molly didn't ask questions. She was used to her father doing strange, impulsive things that somehow made sense later. Within minutes, the girls were resting on the worn-out sofa, damp towels pressed to their foreheads, and a fan blowing on low beside them. "They haven't said a word," Rowan murmured. Molly knelt by them, eyes soft. They're scared and dehydrated. Who would leave kids out there like that? Rowan didn't answer. He had a sinking feeling he already knew someone who didn't deserve the title of parent. That night, after the girls fell into a deep, fevered sleep, Rowan stepped out onto the porch, cradling a chipped mug of black coffee. The moon hung heavy over the hills, casting silver light over the dust. Molly joined him barefoot. "Are they staying?" she asked simply. Rowan didn't answer right away. "I don't even know their names. Maybe that's not what they need right now." He looked at her, his little girl who had learned to speak in full sentences by 3, who watched her mother die and never cried about it in front of anyone. "They can stay," he finally said, "at least until I figure out what to do." Molly leaned against his arm. "You'll figure it out. You always do." But Rowan wasn't sure this time. As he stood there, sipping bitter coffee and listening to the wind rustle dry grass, he realized something that made his throat tighten. In all the years since losing his wife, he hadn't once felt needed. Tonight, 2 tiny strangers had changed that. Rowan had always believed that silence could be a kind of music. After his wife passed, silence was all he allowed himself. Not the quiet of peace, but the hollow stillness of absence, the kind that lingered between broken chords, or in the hush after a door that would never open again. But the silence in his cabin that morning wasn't that kind. It was different. It was cautious, hopeful, alive. The 2 girls had slept through the night. When Rowan came into the living room just after sunrise, they were still curled together on the couch, like twins in the womb. One of them had kicked the blanket halfway off. He gently tugged it back up. Molly was already in the kitchen slicing apples. "She's the older one," she said, nodding toward the taller girl with freckles and tangled blonde hair. She kept reaching for the other one in her sleep. "I think her name is Dusty." Dusty Rowan raised an eyebrow. She whispered it. "Might be a nickname." "The little one's called June." Rowan stood silent for a moment, as if tasting the names. Dusty. June. Names that felt like they belonged to prairie skies and porch songs. "Good ears," he said. Molly smirked. "Well, you raised me." He poured coffee into his battered tin mug and took a long sip. His eyes drifted to the old upright piano in the corner, once his wife's sanctuary. It had sat untouched for 5 years, collecting dust and silence. Just like him. By mid-morning, Dusty and June were awake and sitting up though they barely spoke. June held the stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Dusty stared at Rowan with eyes that had already seen too much for someone so young. He knelt in front of them. "I'm Rowan. That's Molly, my daughter. This is our home. You're safe here." Dusty nodded, cautious. June clutched her sister's arm tightly. Rowan studied their faces. They had the same eyes, pale and sharp, but Dusty had a kind of gravity to her. The kind of child who had memorized the sound of a slammed car door and learned too early how to take care of someone else. He didn't push. Instead, he did what came natural. He picked up the old guitar leaning by the window. The strings hadn't been touched in years, but they responded to his fingers with a sound that surprised him. Soft, worn, and honest. Rowan sat down on the edge of the coffee table and began picking a simple, slow progression. Nothing fancy. Just the chords his hands remembered even when his heart had tried to forget them. Again. Dusty's head tilted slightly. June stopped rocking. Rowan hummed a bar. Then without a word, he started to sing low and gravelly, like an old radio playing in a roadside diner. The melody was an old folk lullaby, one his wife used to sing to Molly in the evenings when the world was kind. Lay your head where the cotton grows, the wind is soft, and the river knows. The notes hung in the air like dust in the sunlight. When he looked up, Dusty's lips were moving, mouthing the words barely audible. Rowan softened his playing, let his voice trail off. The girls stared at him as if he had just spoken a language they hadn't heard in a long time. "Do you know that song?" he asked. Dusty nodded. "My mama used to sing it," she whispered. Then, almost inaudibly, "before." Rowan said nothing, but a knot formed in his throat. He simply strummed once more and looked to Molly, who was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, and tears threatening the edge of her composure. "She needs a real guitar," Molly said. Rowan blinked. "What she, Dusty? The way she listened, the way she followed your hands. She could learn fast. Both of them could." Rowan looked down at his guitar, then to the girls. His instincts, quiet for so long, were stirring. Music had been the thing that bound his family once. Could it bind this one together? "Two, I can teach you," he said to them gently. "If you'd like." Dusty looked at June. The younger girl nodded almost imperceptibly. "Okay," Dusty said. Later that afternoon, Rowan pulled the old box of spare guitar picks and worn-down sheet music from the attic. He let the girls feel the frets, pluck the strings, laugh when the notes came out squeaky or wrong. But then something happened. Dusty, after watching him demonstrate a few chords, replicated them almost instantly. She didn't just mimic the shape of his hands, she understood. "Wait," he said, amazed. "Do that again." She did. And then, from memory, she played the intro he had shown her once. Rowan looked at Molly, stunned. "She's a natural?" Dusty beamed just a flicker, but it was the first true smile he'd seen on her face. June clapped her hands softly. That night, Rowan sat on the porch, while the three girls played with flashlights in the backyard, laughing as June tried to catch fireflies that didn't exist. The guitar rested against his knee. Molly sat beside him, arms wrapped around her knees. "You saw it, right?" she asked. "Saw what?" How Dusty's hands moved, how she followed the music. That wasn't just learning, that was something else. He nodded. "I think she added softly she was meant to find us." Rowan didn't reply. He simply looked up at the sky where the stars were beginning to stitch themselves across the fabric of the night. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like tuning, like something broken was quietly being brought back into harmony. The first time Dusty and June walked into the small public school at Dusty Rock, they were holding hands. Tight, like their lives depended on it. Rowan had offered to walk them to class. They refused. "They're already going to stare," Dusty said in the quietest voice. "It's better if we go in alone." Rowan stood there in the school parking lot feeling helpless and hollowed out. Molly gave him a soft squeeze on the arm before jogging ahead to her own building. "I'll keep an eye on them," she promised over her shoulder. He watched the three of them go, his daughter and the two girls who weren't his, but whose futures were starting to matter just as much. The school smelled like every small-town American school, bleach and pencil shavings, cafeteria corn dogs and gym floor polish. But to Dusty and June, it was a battlefield. They'd never been in a real school before. Not for long anyway. The rules confused them. The fluorescent lights buzzed like hornets. The noise of other kids felt too sharp, but worst of all were the looks. The first whisper came from a girl in a pink shirt and glitter sandals. "That's the Trash Twins. They live in the cabin with the weird guitar guy." Dusty didn't look. She just kept walking, guiding June like a ship through storm waters. By lunch, it got worse. The older boys in the corner of the cafeteria stared. One of them laughed too loud and mimicked the sound of a dying cat, pretending it was Dusty singing. June dropped her plastic spoon. Her eyes flooded. Dusty stood. Her chair scraped. Rowan, of course, wasn't there. But if he had been, he might have been proud. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just walked away, pulling June gently by the hand, and found a quiet table by the window, where no one else sat. They didn't eat. They just waited for the bell to ring. That evening, Rowan noticed something was off. The girls were quieter than usual. Dusty, who had started humming around the house while cleaning or helping Molly, was completely silent. Rough first day, he asked after dinner as he tuned the guitar. Dusty shrugged. June stared at the floor. Molly came in from the kitchen drying her hands. It's the kids. They're mean. Rowan's jaw clenched. Did something happen? They're calling them names, making fun of where they come from. And of you. He blinked. Me, yeah. One boy said you were a backwoods has-been who lives in a shack and collects orphans like strays. For a moment, Rowan saw red. His hands tightened on the neck of the guitar fingers digging into the wood. But then he looked up and saw Dusty watching him, waiting to see how he would react. He exhaled. Slowly. Do you believe that he asked her gently? Dusty shook her head. Then neither should they. Later that night, when Molly had gone to bed, Rowan found Dusty sitting alone on the back porch, knees to her chest, staring at the stars. He sat down next to her, the boards creaking under his weight. You know, there was a time when people thought I was going to be somebody. She didn't answer. I played in bands, wrote songs that made people cry, even got offered a spot on a touring circuit once. But I turned it down. Why? He stared out into the dark. Because your mama, Molly's mama, she hated touring. Said she'd rather sing for the moon and a campfire than a crowd of drunks in Denver. So we stayed. Do you regret it? She asked. He thought a moment. No. But I regret not picking up the guitar again after she died. I let the music die with her. Until you girls showed up. Dusty's eyes shimmered. I'm not good. You're better than good. You're brave. I don't feel brave. That's because brave doesn't feel like loud yelling or big speeches. Sometimes it feels like going to school the next day even after you've been laughed at, or picking up a guitar even when you're scared you'll mess up. He looked down at her hands, small, calloused, from just a week of learning. You've got music in you, Dusty. Real music. The kind that makes people listen. The next morning, Rowan surprised the girls with a small cardboard box. Inside a set of matching notebooks, 2 new pencils, and a set of guitar picks, blue for Dusty, yellow for June. Song journals, he said. Sheepish. If you ever want to write your own stuff. June smiled so wide her dimples showed. Dusty picked up her pick and turned it over like it was treasure. Molly leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling. We should sign them up for the community open mic next month. Rowan turned. But there's a stage at the Dusty Rock Harvest Fair. Local kids sing play-read poetry. No competition, just expression. It's small, but... Dusty's eyes lit up. June looked both terrified and thrilled. Only if they want to, Rowan said quickly. Dusty nodded once. I want to. Rowan didn't remember exactly when the humming started. It wasn't loud, just soft threads of melody floating from room to room, like warm wind through a screen door. At first he thought it was in his head, some phantom echo of the past, the way grief liked to disguise itself in familiar sounds. But then he realized it wasn't a memory. It was Dusty. She hummed when she washed dishes, tapped rhythms on her knees, with a spoon while waiting for the water to boil, and even whistled quietly while sweeping the porch with a broom too big for her arms. June followed her like a shadow, listening, sometimes giggling at the made-up lyrics Dusty would whisper when she thought no one could hear. Rowan heard it all, and something in him stirred. One afternoon he walked into the living room and found Dusty sitting cross-legged on the worn rug beside the old upright piano. She had one hand inside its open panel, her fingers brushing the inner strings like harp wires. The piano hadn't worked in years. The tuning was shot, half the keys stuck. But still she played, or at least tried to. You know that thing hasn't been touched since Molly was a toddler, he said, gently kneeling beside her. Dusty didn't look up. It still sings. You just have to know where to press. Rowan leaned in. She plucked a string near the back one deep inside the belly of the instrument, and a soft, low note rumbled through the old wood. It was imperfect gritty, but real. You're not wrong, he said. She looked up at him, then hesitant. Was this hers? He nodded slowly. Your mama loved that piano. She used to sit right here and write lullabies. She had this theory that every piece of music already lived inside an instrument, you just had to be patient enough to let it come out. Dusty smiled faintly. That's a nice thought. She said people are the same. That night, Rowan opened the closet in his bedroom he hadn't touched in years. Inside were 2 old binders full of handwritten sheet music, a cassette recorder, and a scarf that still smelled faintly of vanilla and pine. He carried the binders to the kitchen table, sat down with a cup of tea, and began to read. Molly walked in halfway through the second song. Are you okay? She asked, cautious. He looked up, a ghost of a grin playing on his lips. I'm reading your mother's music. And for once, it doesn't hurt. She came closer and peered over his shoulder. The pages were full of loops and swirls, her mother's unmistakable handwriting lyrics, scribbled in margins, chord progressions that curled and bent like rivers. I used to think I had to bury this part of me to survive, Rowan said. But maybe I was just waiting. For what? He glanced toward the back room where soft humming still drifted. For them. Over the next week, the cabin became something it hadn't been in a long time, musical. Mornings began with Dusty practicing simple scales on the acoustic guitar, while June clapped along offbeat but proud. Molly would make cinnamon toast, while Rowan adjusted tuners, restrung necks, and scribbled melody lines into a yellowing notepad. In the evenings, they sat outside beneath the amber glow of the porch light. Rowan played old cowboy ballads and let the girls take turns making up verses. June sang about clouds shaped like ducks. Dusty made up a song called The Dog Who Ate the Sky, and everyone laughed so hard they cried. One evening after June had gone to bed, Dusty stayed behind. She seemed restless, her foot tapping against the porch rail. What's on your mind? Rowan asked. She hesitated. Do you think I could ever write a real song you already have? I mean, one that makes people feel something. He reached over, gently tapped her temple. Dusty, everything that matters is already in there. The only thing you need to do is listen. She looked down at her guitar. The harvest fair's in 3 weeks. I know. What if I mess up? Rowan smiled. Then you mess up. But you'll do it on your own terms, and you'll get back up. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He stiffened, surprised, but then let himself relax. It had been years since someone had rested against him like that, without needing something. This was trust. This was healing, slow and steady. You're the first person who's ever believed in me, Dusty whispered. He didn't say it, but the thought came anyway. You're the first person who's made me believe in myself again. Late that night, Rowan couldn't sleep. He stood in the middle of the cabin, the light off the moon casting long, pale beams across the floorboards. A breeze blew through the open window, rustling the edge of a song journal left on the table. He walked to the piano, opened the lid, pressed one key. It stuck. He pressed another. This one made a low, wobbly note that quivered in the air like a shy voice. Rowan sat down, ran his fingers along the keys. The instrument groaned beneath him like an old friend, awakened from a long sleep. He didn't play. Not yet. But he sat there for a long time in the moonlight, hands resting above the ivory, and ash breathing in the quiet music that lived beneath everything, just waiting to be invited back into the light. Dusty had always known how to disappear. Not in the magical sense, but in the quiet way that girls like her had to learn when the world became too loud, too sharp, or too cruel. In the foster homes on the road, under truck stop canopies, where eyes lingered too long, she learned to shrink, to vanish in plain sight. But she couldn't disappear on the Harvest Fair stage, not when her name was printed in black Sharpie on the sign-up sheet tacked to the fence outside the Baptist church. Not when June was practicing her harmony every morning with a toothbrush in her mouth, and certainly not when Rowan had started dusting off the family's old speaker amp, tightening knobs that hadn't turned in 5 years. The morning of the Harvest Fair arrived like an old friend in dusty boots, hot, loud, and pulsing with the scent of kettle corn and corn dogs, hay bales, and diesel fumes. The fields were alive with booths selling quilts, jams, and wind chimes made of broken spoons. Children chased each other in cowboy hats too big for their heads. Retired men tuned their banjos under makeshift shade tents. The main stage stood on the south edge of the fairgrounds, nothing more than plywood on cinder blocks, with a striped canopy above, and 2 dented microphones that crackled every few minutes like tired lungs. Backstage, Dusty gripped her guitar so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You don't have to do this," Rowan said softly behind her. She didn't answer right away. "Then I want to." Her voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. The MC, a red-faced man named Cal Renner, who ran the local feed store, tapped the mic and let out a booming laugh. "All right, folks, we're gonna keep this train rolling with our next act. Let's see here, what do we got? Rowan Blake and the Girls." That's cute. He chuckled at his own joke. Some people in the crowd followed suit. Rowan stood behind Dusty, and June placing a calming hand on each of their shoulders. He stepped forward toward the mic and adjusted the stand, without a word. His long fingers wrapped around the neck of his guitar, with the same care he might use to hold a newborn. Dusty and June followed him on stage, and the laughter began, from somewhere in the back of the crowd. "Look at the charity cases. Is this open mic or an adoption drive? Sing us a song, Raggedy." And Dusty flinched. June shrank behind her sister, clutching her little notebook with both hands. Rowan turned, his jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He knew this was their moment, not his. Dusty stepped to the mic. She looked too small, too young, too fragile against the harsh sun and sea of cowboy hats and skeptical stares. But then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, unfolded it, flattened it against her thigh. Took a breath. "My name is Dusty," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "This is my sister June. We wrote this song for the man who gave us a home when no one else did." A hush started to fall across the crowd like wind dying down before a storm. He didn't save us because he had to. He saved us because that's who he is. We're not here to sound perfect. We're here to say thank you. Rowan blinked. June stepped beside her and nodded. They turned, and Rowan began to play. The first chord was soft fingertips brushing the strings like a prayer. The melody had no title. It didn't need one. It was the sound of porch swings and second chances. The sound of nights with empty fridges and full hearts. Dusty began to sing. Her voice was thin at first, fragile even. But then June joined her, and together their harmonies filled in the spaces like a quilt stitched over a wound. He found us where the road got quiet. In a bed of dust and fear, he didn't ask where we had come from. He just held us close and near. The crowd fell silent. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. People who had snickered minutes ago were now shifting in their chairs, their hands resting quietly in their laps. A toddler in the front row stopped squirming. An old veteran beside the lemonade stand closed his eyes and listened. Rowan's solo came in like breath light and aching. His hands moved over the strings like they knew the story before it was told. Like they had lived it, and they had. When the last note rang out, there was no applause, not at first. Just a deep collective silence. Then a woman in the second row stood. She wore a faded sun hat and had tears streaked down both cheeks. She clapped once, twice, then again. Others followed, until the applause became a swell, honest and thunderous. Dusty stepped back from the mic and instinctively reached for Rowan's hand. He took it, and June took his other. In that moment, they were not a broken man and two lost girls. They were a family. Right there on a makeshift stage beneath the wide, unforgiving sky. Cal Renner returned to the microphone, blinking like he didn't know what had just happened. Well, I guess sometimes you don't need polish, just heart. Rowan smiled faintly. That was enough. The applause had ended, but its echo stayed in Rowan's chest long after the last claps faded. It wasn't just noise, it was something heavier, a kind of weightlessness, like letting go of something he didn't know he'd been holding. He stepped off the stage with Dusty, and June still gripping his hands, their palms sweaty but firm. Molly met them near the edge of the tent, arms open, face glowing. "You did it," she whispered, wrapping both girls into a hug that was more like a blanket. "You really did it." Rowan stood back watching, his fingers still tingled from the strings, his ears ringing from the raw silence that had followed their final chord. It wasn't the best music he'd ever played. Technically, they'd missed a note or two. June had come in early on the third line. Dusty's voice cracked at the bridge, and none of that mattered, because they'd told the truth. And Dusty Rock had listened. They wandered the fairgrounds afterward, not as performers, but as a family. People stopped them, some cautiously, as if unsure whether they were allowed to speak. Others, warmly hands, outstretched voices, soft with apology or admiration. An older man in a worn military vest clasped Rowan's shoulder and said, "That song, it reminded me of when my wife died. Thank you." A young couple with a baby in a sling handed June a caramel apple and whispered, "You were brave." Even Cal Renner, the MC who joked about them on stage, approached with his hat in his hands. "I owe y'all an apology," he said, voice gravelly. "Didn't realize I was watching something sacred today. Won't forget it." Rowan nodded. "Neither will we." Dusty looked up at him. "Is this what it's like when people hear you?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But it's rare when they actually listen." That night, the cabin was full of light, not just from the lamps, but from something brighter. Joy, disbelief, a soft hum that hadn't been there before. Molly made grilled cheese and tomato soup. June drew a picture of the stage with crayon fireworks. Dusty copied her lyrics into a clean page of her notebook, writing slower than usual, like she wanted the memory to dry between the lines. Rowan sat on the porch, guitar across his lap, fingers idly drifting over the strings. Not playing, just touching, remembering. He didn't know how to describe the feeling inside him. It wasn't pride, it wasn't relief. It was something older, something like healing. Later that night, when the girls were tucked in and Molly was asleep, Rowan remained outside watching the stars fade into mist. Footsteps creaked behind him. Dusty, in her oversized nightshirt and bare feet, climbed into the rocker beside his. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "Me neither." She stared out into the night, then looked at him. "Were you scared?" He blinked. On stage, she nodded. He exhaled slowly. "More than I've been in years." Her brow furrowed. "But you didn't show it. That's the trick," he said. "You don't get rid of fear. You just walk with it." They rocked in silence for a moment, the breeze rustling the dried grasses beyond the fence. Then softly, "I saw someone crying today. A lady in the second row. I saw her too. She looked like my mom used to." before she stopped singing. Rowan turned. Your mom was a singer, Dusty hesitated. She used to hum a lot. Before the world got loud. He didn't press. He didn't need to. The next morning brought another letter from the county. Rowan opened it with a sigh and sat at the kitchen table while the girls fed the chickens out back. Molly hovered nearby, arms crossed. Is it about them? Rowan nodded. Welfare check. They want to confirm living conditions. They're not taking them, are they? He looked up, jaw tight. Not if I can help it. She moved closer. They belong here, Dad. You know that, right? He did. Every fiber of him knew it. And yet the law didn't always agree with love. That afternoon, Rowan did something he hadn't done since his wife's funeral. He walked into the local courthouse wearing a clean shirt and boots that didn't squeak. He stood in front of a clerk with kind eyes and a tired smile and asked what he needed to do to start guardianship paperwork. Are you family? She asked. He hesitated. Not legally. Her eyes softened. Then let's change that. Back at home, Dusty sat by the piano again. The lid was open. Keys still chipped and yellowed. She tapped one, then another, then slid her fingers across the jagged board like it was something sacred. June watched from the couch, hugging her knees. Rowan entered carrying a paper bag. Dusty turned. What's that? He smiled. Parts. I'm gonna fix this thing. Might take time, but I think it still has some songs left in it. Dusty beamed. So do we. He froze at her words because they weren't just true. They were prophetic. It started with the quilt. 3 days after the harvest fair, a woman named Hattie Parker showed up at Rowan's cabin with a box wrapped in brown paper and tied with fraying string. She didn't say much, just handed the box to Dusty and said, I saw you sing. This belonged to my sister. She would have loved you. Inside was a handmade quilt stitched from faded flannel shirts, cotton dresses, and one square that looked suspiciously like it came from a wedding veil. Sewn into one corner were the words, to the brave ones who choose love over fear. Dusty cried when she saw it. So did June. Rowan had to turn away for a moment to collect himself. That quilt, like the performance, wasn't perfect, but it was a symbol, and symbols had a way of echoing longer than applause. After that, things changed. The townspeople no longer whispered when Rowan walked into the general store. They nodded, said hello, asked how the girls were doing. Some even remembered their names. A retired music teacher offered to give Dusty and June piano lessons on Saturdays. The local diner Cora Mays set up a Songbird special on the chalkboard free breakfast for any child who performed original music at community events. And Cal Renner, the very man who had mocked them over a microphone, put a framed photo of the girls on the wall of his feed store, right beside a black and white picture of his own daughters from decades past. At first, Rowan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being seen. But Molly put it best one night over dinner when she said people watched us on that stage and realized they were wrong. And the best folks, the ones worth knowing, admit it when they've been wrong. One of the more unexpected visitors was a tall, quiet teenage boy named Eli, who knocked on their door late one afternoon, holding a scuffed guitar and a peace offering in the form of an apology. I was one of the kids who laughed, he said, looking straight at Dusty. I didn't mean to be cruel. I just didn't know how to act around something honest. Rowan watched as Dusty stared at the boy, blinking, then slowly stepped forward and held out her hand. It's okay, she said. But if you're gonna stay, you have to play something. Eli grinned, relieved, and sat down on the porch steps. His fingers were clumsy, but his effort was sincere. The three of them, Dusty, June, and Eli, played until the light gave out and the mosquitoes drove them inside. But not every change was comfortable. With visibility came scrutiny. Child Protective Services called again. A social worker scheduled another visit. This time, they wanted to see documentation of emotional development and evidence of a stable educational environment. Rowan kept his cool on the phone, but after he hung up, he stared at the wall for a long time. "What if love isn't enough?" he finally said aloud. Molly looked up from the kitchen table. "Then we show them that love made everything else possible." She was 13 years old, and yet somehow she had always carried the wisdom of someone who'd lived more lives than her calendar years could explain. That Sunday, Pastor Wilkins invited the Blake family to speak at the end of the morning service. Rowan, as expected, declined. "I don't do pulpits," he muttered. But Dusty surprised them all by saying, "I'd like to go." And so she did. Wearing the dress Molly had helped her patch up, Dusty stood in front of the congregation with June by her side and spoke softly into a mic that didn't buzz for once. "We used to be invisible," she said. "We thought that if we made ourselves small enough, quiet enough, maybe we'd survive. But Mr. Rowan didn't let us stay small. He gave us songs instead of silence. And now, we're not scared anymore." There was no applause, only nods, misty eyes, and the sound of tissues being pulled from pockets. Afterward, Pastor Wilkins walked up to Rowan outside the church steps. "You didn't say a word in there," he said. "Didn't have to," Rowan replied. The pastor smiled. "That's what fatherhood looks like." Rowan looked away, not because he disagreed, but because the truth of it was almost too much to carry. Back at home that evening, the family sat around the porch with slices of peach cobbler and a breeze that smelled faintly of honeysuckle. "Do you think people really change?" Dusty asked. Rowan took a bite of cobbler, chewed thoughtfully. "I think people remember who they are when they're reminded gently enough." Dusty nodded, satisfied. Then she turned to June and whispered something. June giggled, ran inside, and returned with the song journal. "We wrote a new one," Dusty said, eyes shining. Rowan picked up his guitar. "Well, what are we waiting for?" As they began to sing, the wind picked up slightly, just enough to lift the corner of the quilt, now draped over the porch railing. It fluttered like a flag, a banner, a quiet declaration that sometimes the softest voices could carry the furthest. It started with a video. Rowan hadn't known someone had filmed their performance at the Harvest Fair, at least not until a woman from San Antonio messaged Molly through the church's Facebook page, asking if the two miracle girls who sang with their dad were available for an interview. The clip had been shared by a visitor from Austin, then by someone from Amarillo. Within a week, it had over 60,000 views. And suddenly, they weren't just the quiet family at the edge of Dusty Rock. They were news. The next call came from a music nonprofit that helped fund arts education for rural youth. The woman on the phone had a smooth, practiced voice and called Dusty and June, gifted beyond their years. "We'd love to bring them into one of our special programs," she said. "We offer mentorship housing exposure to top-tier conservatories. We have connections in Nashville, Los Angeles." Rowan cleared his throat. "They're not looking to leave their home." "Mr. Blake?" she said with a knowing tone. "Sometimes home is where their future begins, not where it ends." He hung up politely, but unease lodged in his chest like a stone. 2 days later, the knock came. Not the tentative knock of a neighbor or the firm rap of a delivery driver. This was official. A black SUV idled outside the gate, and 2 women in tailored clothes stood on the porch with briefcases and a clipboard. "Mr. Rowan Blake." He nodded. "We represent the Caldwell family." Rowan's eyes narrowed. Who the younger woman adjusted her glasses. Dusty, and June's grandparents. The living room that afternoon felt colder than usual, despite the Texas heat outside. The representative sat straight-backed on the couch, speaking in polite, clipped tones. They handed over documents, birth certificates, affidavits, photos of a large estate near Santa Fe. Rowan barely looked at them. "They've been searching for these girls for over a year," one of them said. The mother. Your wife, we presume, left home with them under complicated circumstances. She wasn't my wife, Rowan said quietly. June huddled close beside Molly. Dusty sat on the floor, knees drawn up, eyes wide but unreadable. She passed through our system anonymously, Rowan continued. We don't know the full story. But I do know she left them behind, and we've taken care of them ever since. The women exchanged glances. We don't doubt your care, one said. But the Caldwells are prepared to regain custody. They're offering a stable home, elite education, financial security. Rowan's voice rose not loud but fierce. They've already got a home. The older woman opened a leather folder and slid across a letter. In accordance with the state of Texas, guardianship will be reviewed. That night, Rowan sat at the kitchen table, the letter still in his hand. He hadn't told the girls yet, not in full, but Dusty had seen his face. She always saw too much. Molly paced behind him. They can't just come in here and take them. They can, Rowan said flatly. If the court agrees, it's in their best interest. And what about love? She snapped. He looked up. What about the songs we sing on the porch? The way June clings to your hand? The way Dusty lights up when you show her a new chord? He didn't answer, because it all felt too fragile now, like one gust of legal wind might blow their whole life away. That weekend, the family drove to the edge of town to a ridge Molly loved that overlooked a dried riverbed. They laid out a blanket, packed peanut butter sandwiches, said nothing for a long time. Then Dusty reached for her song journal, and without looking up, said, If they take us, I won't sing anymore. Rowan swallowed hard. Don't say that. I mean it. He turned to her. Music lives in you. No one can take that. She closed the journal. They can take you. June looked up, blinking fast as if trying not to cry. Rowan wrapped an arm around both of them, pulling them close. No one's taking anyone, he said, even if the words felt too big for the truth. But even as the uncertainty hung like dust in the air, something else began to form beneath it. A quiet resolve. Over the next few days, Rowan gathered every photo, every school paper, every doctor's note and recital flyer. He typed a letter by hand to the family court, attached testimonies from the pastor, the music teacher, even Cal Renner. Then he sat down with Dusty and June and told them everything. The girls didn't cry. Instead, Dusty asked one question. Can we write a song for the hearing? Rowan blinked. What you said, music tells the truth better than words. He smiled, heart-aching. Yes, he said. Yes, it does. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. sharp, in a beige courthouse that smelled of old paper and lemon-scented floor wax. It was the kind of place where families unraveled in front of strangers, and decisions were made in fluorescent silence. Rowan wore his best shirt, clean-pressed, and a little too tight across the shoulders. Molly wore a simple navy dress. Dusty and June each held their song journals, like lifelines, their fingers smudged with pencil and hope. When they stepped into the courtroom, the air shifted. A judge with tired eyes sat at the bench, framed by state flags. The Caldwells were already seated, their lawyer adjusting his tie and whispering last-minute notes. Beside them sat the two representatives from Child Services, detached, observant, clinical. Rowan reached for Dusty's hand. She squeezed his fingers hard. Whatever happens, he whispered, you were never a mistake. She didn't respond, but her eyes filled. The Caldwells spoke first. Their lawyer described a stable household with multiple bedrooms, private tutors, a live-in nurse. Photos were shown manicured lawns, riding stables, a gleaming grand piano no one seemed to play. They can offer these children every opportunity, the lawyer concluded. A life of security, culture, access, not struggle. The judge nodded, jotting something down. Then Rowan was called. He rose slowly, cleared his throat once. My name is Rowan Blake, he began. I'm not their blood. I don't have a trust fund or a summer house. I live at the edge of Dusty Rock, in a cabin with 3 bedrooms, 2 guitars, and a piano that barely holds a tune. A flicker of a smile passed through the courtroom. He continued. When I found Dusty and June, they weren't just hungry for food. They were hungry for stillness, for someone to listen, to belong. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I could talk all day about what we've built together, but I'd rather let them show you. The judge raised an eyebrow. Your Honor, Rowan said, with your permission, they'd like to play you something. There was a brief pause. The room shifted, whispered. The judge leaned back in his chair. Proceed. Rowan turned. Dusty and June stood side by side. No microphones, no speaker system. Just the open air of the courtroom and the kind of silence that only falls when something sacred is about to happen. Rowan began to strum. The chords were simple, the same 4 they had practiced every evening for a week. Dusty's voice came in soft and low, like a morning breeze brushing through an old screen door. We didn't come from money. We didn't come from plans. But we found a place that held us with weathered, calloused hands. Then June's voice layered gently on top. No mansion walls to hide us. No chandeliers to shine. But we learned to sing by firelight and made that silence mine. Rowan's hands didn't tremble, though his heart did. When the last chord faded, there was no applause, just stillness. The judge leaned forward. Girls, he said, his voice steady. Did you write that yourselves? Dusty nodded. We just wrote how it feels. The judge took a long breath. Thank you. He looked down at the paperwork. The polished lawyers shifted in their seats. The Caldwells sat upright, lips tight. But the tide had already turned. The ruling came 20 minutes later, delivered in the same neutral tone as grocery store instructions. The court acknowledges the blood relation of the petitioners and their resources. However, it also acknowledges the extraordinary emotional development and documented evidence of consistent care under Mr. Rowan Blake. The judge paused. Guardianship will remain with Mr. Blake under permanent placement review. Should any concerns arise, the court reserves the right to reevaluate. But as of today, these girls are home. June squealed before covering her mouth. Dusty's shoulders sagged like she'd been holding up the roof of the world and could finally set it down. Rowan closed his eyes. Just for a second. Molly burst into tears and hugged both her sisters at once. Outside the courthouse, the sun felt brighter than it had in weeks. People passed by, some staring curiously, others pausing to offer quiet smiles. The Caldwells didn't speak as they left, just nodded once toward Rowan. Whether it was acknowledgement or resignation, he couldn't say. But he didn't chase them. He didn't need to, because his family was walking beside him. That night back on the porch, Dusty handed Rowan a folded note. It was written in blocky cursive with tiny hearts in the margins. Dear Mr. Rowan, you didn't give birth to us, but you gave us a song, and no one ever did that before. So, we pick you. Forever. Love, Dusty and June. Rowan didn't cry. Not then. But he went inside, picked up the old photo of his wife that sat on the mantel, and whispered, We've got a whole band now. The cabin had never been louder. Not from shouting or noise, but from life. Music spilled through the open windows like wind. Dusty played soft melodies in the corner, while June sang along with a ribbon in her hair and a tambourine on her knee. Molly sat at the table grading herself on an old homeschool worksheet with exaggerated concentration. Rowan was on the porch, tightening the last screw into the newly repaired upright piano. It had taken him weeks. He'd ordered parts from 3 different counties, sanded down sticky keys, restrung broken hammers. At night, when the house fell quiet, he'd sit alone with the lid lifted gently, tapping each key, listening for memories, listening for her. And now it was ready. He pushed the bench back and sat down, fingers hovering over the ivory, then gently pressing the first chord. It was deep, warm, imperfect. The note trembled like something unsure of its own return. Then the next. And the next. Dusty peeked around the corner. June followed. Rowan kept playing. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The melody he stitched together wasn't from memory. It was new. Unfinished. Honest. Molly drifted into the room and sat cross-legged on the floor. "You writing something?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Yeah." For her, he nodded. They all knew who he meant. The music came slowly, like a letter written by hand. Not rushed, not forced, just one line at a time. It had no title at first, but in his mind, he kept hearing her name. Claire. The woman who once filled this house with lullabies and lavender. The woman who taught Molly to sing before she could read. The woman who'd sat at this very piano 7 months pregnant, playing waltzes to the unborn heartbeat she already loved. He thought he'd buried that part of himself. But love doesn't get buried. It waits. By the end of the week, the melody had grown roots. It became a song, not a sad one, but not exactly happy either. It had the tenderness of a whispered prayer and the quiet strength of someone learning how to breathe again. Rowan taught it to the girls in pieces. Dusty took the verses. June learned the bridge. Molly, always the backbone, held the rhythm subtle but steady. They practiced at night on the porch, fireflies blinking approval, the Texas heat finally beginning to ease as summer tipped into fall. Then came the invitation. The town was planning a harvest revival, a community event to celebrate local resilience. After the fair performance had gone viral, several townsfolk insisted the Blakes should headline. Rowan hesitated. He hadn't stood on a real stage in over a decade. Not one with lights. Not one with people expecting something from him. But then Dusty said, "It's her song, right?" He nodded. "Then let's sing it for her." The stage was larger this time. Real lights. Real sound equipment. Real nerves. Dusty fidgeted with her dress. June wore new boots that squeaked every time she shifted. Molly tested the mic, then retested it 3 more times. Rowan stood off to the side, guitar strapped across his back. Hands sweating. The crowd was larger than any of them expected. Not just townsfolk, but visitors from neighboring counties. People who'd seen the video. People who had felt something from it. People who came looking for hope. Cal Renner, now unofficial town MC and reformed skeptic, stepped to the mic. "Folks," he said, clearing his throat, "I could introduce this next family with a list of accolades, but truth be told, they don't need it. They already reminded us what matters." He turned, nodded. "Please welcome Rowan Blake and his girls." The lights weren't blinding this time. The crowd wasn't intimidating. They were just people. Listening. Rowan sat at the piano. Dusty stood to his left, guitar in hand. June clutched her tambourine like a sacred relic. Molly, arms crossed, stood at the back of the stage like a pillar of quiet resolve. Rowan played the opening notes, and the silence that followed felt different than any before. It wasn't full of doubt. It was full of reverence. Then Dusty began to sing. She was the song I used to play before the strings went still. The porch was quiet. Nights ran long, and time forgot to heal. Rowan took the chorus voice gravelly and raw. But songs don't die. They just go quiet, until the heart's ready to try, and I found her name in chords again, beneath this dusty sky. June joined on the bridge. Molly added harmony. By the final verse, the 4 of them were woven together, not just by blood, or papers, or hardship, but by music, by the truth they had lived, and by the love they had chosen. The applause was long and loud. But even before it started, Rowan felt that quiet certainty rising in his chest. This was no longer just a home. This was a life being sung into existence. Back at the cabin, long after the stage had emptied, and the last thank you had been spoken, Rowan placed the handwritten lyrics of the song inside a frame. He hung it above the piano. Above it, he added a small wooden plaque. It read, "Claire's song for the family she never got to finish, and the one who finished it for her." Autumn came to Dusty Rock like a whispered apology. The heat that once cracked the earth now gave way to amber mornings, the air cooler, sharper scented with cedar and hay. Leaves gathered in small golden clusters outside Rowan's porch, and the hills in the distance blushed rust-red beneath a sky that no longer burned, but glowed. Inside the cabin, the piano was no longer a relic. It was a companion. Each morning began with its voice, sometimes Dusty's fingers trailing across the keys, while June sang beside her, sometimes Molly composing soft harmonies that lingered through breakfast. Rowan played too less like a man trying to remember, and more like someone ready to create. The family had fallen into a rhythm that wasn't perfect, but honest. Mornings were for music and lessons, afternoons for chores and laughter. Evenings for porch light songs, shared silences, and the kind of conversations that never made it into school books. It wasn't a spectacular life, but it was deeply, beautifully real. And that made it sacred. One Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Rowan opened it by the kitchen sink while Dusty strummed in the background. "Dear Mr. Blake, I watched the video of you and the girls at the revival. I cried. Not because it was sad, but because I felt like I was watching something whole. Something rare. I work with youth in Phoenix. We've lost too many to silence, to brokenness. But your story reminded me some songs need only one listener to matter. Please keep singing." J.D. Rowan folded the letter carefully and slid it into the drawer with the others. Since the revival, he'd received dozens like it. Strangers writing, not because they saw a performance, but because they'd felt a truth they recognized. People didn't need polish. They needed something to believe in. One chilly afternoon in late October, Rowan took the girls out to the ridge, their ridge overlooking the dried riverbed, where they'd once feared losing each other. This time, they brought the guitar. Dusty sat in the grass, now taller and surer than the day he'd found her. June nestled against him, warm in her patched jacket. Molly, always half older. Sister, half mother in the making, passed out peanut butter sandwiches shaped like hearts. They played. Not a performance just for themselves. Dusty sang softly, her voice lower than it had been months ago. Fuller. We don't need 1,000 faces, just a patch of earth and sky, a place to plant the chorus, and let the sorrow fly. June added a line off rhythm, but lovely. Rowan laughed. He didn't remember the last time he'd laughed so easily. After the sun began to set, Dusty pulled something from her backpack, a small hand-carved wooden box. She held it out. "I made this in shop class." Rowan blinked. "You took shop," she shrugged. "They let me. I told them it was for you." He opened the box. Inside was a folded scrap of music manuscript paper. On it, 5 simple words were printed in pencil, the song that healed the dust. "It's the first song," she said, "the one from the harvest fair." Rowan looked at her, then June, then Molly, who simply nodded like she'd known all along what it meant. He swallowed hard. "You think it healed me?" Dusty smiled. "No. I think you let yourself be healed." That night, Rowan placed the box beside Claire's photo on the mantel. No candles, no tears. Just a quiet nod. A thank you. Not for the pain, but for the chance to grow beyond it. Winter was coming. The mornings grew colder. Dusty and June kept singing. Molly began tutoring younger kids at the church. Rowan fixed up the old barn out back and turned it into a music room. Local kids started showing up after school with guitars, violins, even an accordion. No auditions, no judgment, just a sign on the door that read, "If you've got a song, come in." And one evening, as the first snow whispered down from a quiet sky, Rowan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee and looked out at the yard where his daughters, because that's what they were, now were dancing. No music playing, just snow and laughter, and the kind of freedom people spend whole lifetimes searching for. Molly joined him. "They're happy," she said. He nodded. "I didn't know I could be again." She leaned her head against his arm. "I think you were always meant to be." He didn't reply, because for the first time he didn't need to say a word. The music in his life was speaking for him, and this time it wouldn't fade. And maybe that's all a family really is. Not just the people we're born to, but the ones who show up when the world turns quiet. Who hand us a song when we've forgotten how to sing. If this story touched something in your heart, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and tell us whether it's a small town, a big city, or somewhere in between. Your presence here matters to us. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of kindness, healing, and hope, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just a place to return to when you need something true. Thank you for spending your time with us today. It means more than you know. Until next time, take good care of your heart and those you share it with.